The rain battered against the fabric-covered wings as the pilot gripped the control stick, fighting to hold his course through the violent tempest that surrounded him. The date was May 26, 1941. The location was 300 miles west of Brest, France, and the time was 21 hours and 10 minutes. The old Swordfish aircraft pitched and rolled violently as wind gusts threatened to flip it completely over. The pilot's hands locked onto the stick, muscles straining to maintain altitude and heading as visibility collapsed to just a few hundred yards in the driving rain. The open cockpit offered no protection from the elements. Moisture ran down the windscreen faster than the pilot could wipe it away. Rain fell like bullets, stinging exposed skin where it struck. Wind that howled at gale force tore at faces and froze goggles faster than numb fingers could clear them. The leather flying suits that were supposed to keep water out had been soaked through hours ago. Water pooled in seats and ran down the backs of men who could no longer feel their fingers through their gloves. Behind each pilot, the observers and air gunners huddled in their cramped positions, shaking from cold so intense it had frozen the water in their bottles solid. The aircraft had been in the air for nearly 2 hours now, 2 hours of battling these relentless conditions, 2 hours spent wondering if they would ever locate their target. And if they did locate it, the grim reality was that survival seemed unlikely. The altimeter showed 800 feet. In waters like these, that meant the aircraft was skimming barely above the wavetops themselves. Mountains of water rose to 30 or even 40 feet high. In the complete darkness, it was nearly impossible to judge height with any real accuracy. More than one swordfish had flown directly into the sea while attempting low-level attacks in these conditions. Somewhere in that darkness and those mountainous seas, a single ship steamed through the night, the Bismarck, the most powerful battleship afloat. Her 8 15-inch guns could hurl shells that weighed a full ton across a distance of 22 miles. She displaced 50,000 tons and carried armor so thick that the finest ships of the Royal Navy could barely dent her. 14 4.1-inch anti-aircraft guns bristled from her superstructure, supplemented by dozens of smaller caliber weapons, all designed to stop exactly what the British were attempting this night. Beneath each attacking aircraft hung the weapon that might accomplish the impossible. A torpedo slung under a canvas-covered plane that looked like it belonged in a museum, not in combat. The Swordfish was a relic from the First World War. Maximum speed of 143 miles per hour with a good tailwind. Open cockpit, fixed landing gear, construction of metal tubes covered in fabric that could be pierced by rifle bullets. The Germans had actually laughed when intelligence reports arrived describing it. This obsolete aircraft could not possibly threaten the pride of the Kriegsmarine. Yet within the next 2 hours, this supposedly worthless biplane and 14 others like it would accomplish what the entire British home fleet could not. They would cripple the Bismarck and seal her fate forever. But the real story of how this relic became the weapon that changed naval warfare forever does not begin in this storm-tossed Atlantic. It begins 7 years earlier in the quiet offices of the Fairey Aviation Company, where designers were creating what would become the most unlikely hero of the Second World War. The year was 1934. The location was Hayes, West London. The drawing boards at Fairey Aviation held blueprints for an aircraft that already looked outdated the moment it was designed. The company had built naval aircraft since 1915, and founder Charles Richard Fairey had established his reputation during the First World War. They understood what the Fleet Air Arm needed better than any other British manufacturer. They needed reconnaissance aircraft to spot for naval gunfire. They needed aircraft that could deliver torpedoes to sink enemy warships. They needed planes capable of operating from the pitching decks of aircraft carriers in all weather. They needed robust construction that could survive harsh maritime environments. And they needed simple maintenance that could be performed by ship crews working with limited facilities and tools. The aircraft designation read TSR-2, standing for Torpedo Spotter Reconnaissance. The proposed design featured a biplane configuration, 2 wings stacked above each other and braced with wires and struts like aircraft from the previous war. Power came from a single Bristol Pegasus 3M.3 radial engine producing 690 horsepower. An open cockpit awaited the crew, who would face the elements at altitude. Winter patrols over the North Atlantic meant temperatures dropping to -20 degrees Celsius. Summer operations in the Mediterranean brought scorching heat. The crew would experience both extremes. The landing gear was fixed, not retractable. This created additional drag and reduced speed, but the fixed gear simplified carrier operations enormously. No hydraulic systems to fail. No complex mechanisms to jam at the critical moment when a pilot needed to land on a pitching flight deck. The wheels were always down, always ready. The whole structure was built from steel tubing covered with fabric, doped tight and painted like aircraft from the First World War. Modern fighters featured all-metal construction with stressed skin, monoplane designs with retractable landing gear, and enclosed cockpits. The comparison seemed damning to many observers. Critics in the Air Ministry questioned whether Britain should be building such obsolete aircraft. Some argued for cancelling the program entirely and waiting for more modern designs to become available. At a time when sleek monoplanes were becoming standard worldwide, the Fairey Design Committee chose the biplane deliberately. This was not ignorance or conservatism. This was calculated engineering. Naval aviation demanded different priorities than land-based aircraft. Carrier operations dictated design choices that seemed backward to those unfamiliar with the constraints. Aircraft carriers in the 1930s had flight decks that were remarkably short. HMS Ark Royal, completed in 1938, had a flight deck only 720 feet long. Modern jet carriers would have decks over 1,000 feet. The Swordfish had to take off and land in less than half that distance, on a deck that pitched and rolled in heavy seas. Carrier operations demanded slow landing speeds and short takeoff runs. The biplane's large wing area provided exactly that capability. The Swordfish could land at 67 miles per hour. Modern carrier aircraft required over 120 miles per hour. The difference was significant. It meant the Swordfish could operate in sea conditions that would force faster aircraft to remain grounded. The open cockpit, though uncomfortable in terrible weather, gave the observer unobstructed views for reconnaissance work. Naval reconnaissance meant hours of searching vast expanses of ocean for enemy ships. The observer needed to see in all directions without obstruction. An enclosed cockpit with windows would create blind spots and reflections that could hide important details. The open cockpit was miserable in bad weather, but far more effective for the mission. The fixed landing gear simplified maintenance aboard ships where every tool and spare part had to be carried aboard. Retractable landing gear meant hydraulic systems, pumps, reservoirs, and actuators, all requiring maintenance, all capable of failing at critical moments. The fixed gear was simple, reliable, and foolproof. Most importantly, the simple construction meant any combat damage could be repaired quickly, even at sea with limited facilities. Combat damage that would write off a modern aircraft could be patched on a Swordfish. Fabric could be sewn. Steel tubes could be spliced. The aircraft could be flying again within hours. The prototype first flew on April 17, 1934. Test pilot Chris Staniland pushed the aircraft through its paces over the Hampshire countryside. The plane handled beautifully, with responsive controls and stable flight characteristics. It forgave pilot errors. It could lift a torpedo weighing over 1,600 pounds, yet still operate from short carrier decks. By 1935, the Air Ministry placed orders. The aircraft received its operational name, Swordfish. 68 aircraft were contracted initially. Production began at Fairey's Hayes factory in early 1936. The first operational aircraft joined the Fleet Air Arm in July 1936, with 825 Naval Air Squadron aboard HMS Glorious. The Swordfish replaced the aging Fairey Seal in reconnaissance roles and the Blackburn Baffin in torpedo bomber duties. Pilots who flew it immediately recognized its qualities. The aircraft was utterly reliable. Engines ran smoothly for hundreds of hours. The simple fabric construction could absorb extraordinary punishment. One pilot later recalled landing with over 200 bullet holes in the wings and fuselage. The fabric could be patched in hours. The Swordfish's crew called it the string bag, a nickname that would become famous throughout the war. The name came from the British housewife's string shopping bag, common in the 1930s. Like those expandable bags, the Swordfish could carry an improbable variety of loads. One day it might carry a torpedo, the next day bombs and flares, then perhaps mines or depth charges. The versatility amazed ground crews. Production expanded rapidly. Fairey built 692 aircraft at their Hayes facility. Blackburn Aircraft at Sherburn and Elmet in Yorkshire built an additional 1,699. Total production reached 2,391 aircraft by the time production ended in August 1944. The Swordfish would remarkably remain in frontline service until VE Day in May 1945, outliving the Fairey albacore that was designed to replace it. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the Fleet Air Arm operated 13 squadrons equipped with Swordfish. 268 aircraft stood ready for action. Most naval officers recognized the Swordfish was already obsolete. Modern monoplane fighters could fly twice as fast, but Britain had what it had, and the Swordfish would have to do. The world was about to discover that speed was not everything. April 1940 brought combat to the Swordfish for the first time. In Norway, aircraft from HMS Furious attacked German ships anchored at Trondheim. Flying through Norwegian fjords, weaving between mountains, they pressed home their attacks against fierce anti-aircraft fire. They scored no decisive hits, but they returned safely, proving that the Swordfish could survive in combat conditions. Then came June 10, 1940, when Italy entered the war. Benito Mussolini's declaration opened the Mediterranean theater to naval conflict. The Regia Marina fielded 6 battleships, including some of the most modern vessels afloat. These ships threatened Britain's vital supply lines to Egypt and India through the Suez Canal. The Royal Navy faced a serious problem. Italian battleships outgunned most British ships in the Mediterranean. Direct naval confrontation risked heavy losses Britain could not afford. The solution had to be unconventional. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commanding the Mediterranean fleet, began planning an audacious strike. If he could attack the Italian fleet in harbour, he might cripple their naval power before they could fully deploy it. The target was Taranto, the main Italian naval base in southern Italy. The plan was Operation Judgment. The weapon would be the Fairey Swordfish, November 11, 1940. HMS Illustrious steamed 270 miles southeast of Taranto. In the hangar deck, 21 Swordfish were prepared for the most daring naval air attack yet attempted. Each aircraft was armed with either a single 18-inch Mark 12 torpedo or bombs and flares. The torpedoes had been specially modified with breakaway wooden fins to allow them to run in the shallow 30 to 40-foot depths of Taranto harbor. Standard torpedoes would have buried themselves in the mud. The modifications were experimental. No one knew if they would work. At 8:35 in the evening, the first wave of 12 Swordfish launched into the darkness. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson led the strike. His aircraft carried a torpedo. Behind him came 5 more torpedo bombers and 6 aircraft loaded with bombs and flares. The flare droppers would illuminate the target. The bombers would suppress anti-aircraft defenses. The torpedo bombers would make the killing strikes. At 9:15, the second wave of 9 Swordfish launched. Lieutenant Commander John Hale led this group. 8 aircraft carried torpedoes. 1 turned back shortly after launch when its auxiliary fuel tank detached. 20 aircraft actually attacked Taranto that night, not 21. The flight took 90 minutes. The crews flew at 8,000 feet, navigating by stars and dead reckoning over the dark Mediterranean. Each observer hunched over his navigation table, calculating drift and ground speed. The pilots held steady courses, trusting their observers completely. 1 degree of error would mean missing the target entirely in the darkness over featureless ocean. Radio silence was absolute. Detection would mean failure. As they approached Taranto, they could see the harbor clearly despite the darkness. The Italians had blunderingly left lights burning throughout the base and the surrounding city. Security concerns about spies apparently outweighed concerns about air attack. The Italian Navy did not believe the British would attempt a torpedo attack on a fortified harbor. Previous analysis suggested the water was too shallow for aerial torpedoes. The Italians were wrong on both counts. Barrage balloons floated above the harbor to deter low-level attacks, but only 27 were deployed instead of the planned 87. Strong winds that day had grounded most of them. The gaps in the balloon barrage gave the Swordfish clear approach paths they should not have had. Luck was favoring the attackers. The first wave arrived at 11:07. The flare droppers flying high released their magnesium flares. The parachute flares drifted down slowly, burning with intense white light. Night turned to day. Every ship in the harbor was suddenly visible in stark relief. The Italians were caught completely by surprise. Air raid sirens began wailing, searchlights stabbed into the sky. Then the guns opened fire. The harbor erupted with anti-aircraft fire. Land batteries fired 13,000 4.1-inch shells during the attack. Ships added thousands more. The sky filled with tracers, explosive shells and shrapnel, red, white and green traces arcing upward. Heavy shells burst in black puffs. The noise was deafening. The defending gunners had never faced an actual attack before. They had drilled, but drill is not combat. Their fire was intense, but not always accurate. They were shooting at slow-moving biplanes that jinked and turned unpredictably. The Swordfish pressed their attacks through the storm of fire. Williamson dove his aircraft toward the battleship Comte de Cavour. At 30 feet altitude and 200 yards range, he released his torpedo. The torpedo ran true, striking the ship below the waterline. The explosion tore a massive hole in the hull. Comte de Cavour settled onto the harbor bottom, partially sunk. Williamson's aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire. He and his observer, Lieutenant Norman Scarlett, survived the crash and were captured. Lieutenant Neil Kempster attacked the new battleship Littorio. His torpedo struck home. Then Lieutenant Charles Lamb made his run on Littorio. Another hit. The battleship was taking water fast. The second wave arrived shortly after midnight. More flares lit the harbor. More anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Lieutenant Gerald Bailey dove toward the cruiser Garigliano. His aircraft was hit and crashed in flames. Bailey and his observer, Lieutenant Henry Slater, were killed. But the other torpedo bombers pressed their attacks. Littorio took a third torpedo hit. The battleship Caio Duilio was struck by one torpedo and began listing badly by 2:39 in the morning. It was over. 20 Swordfish had attacked the main base of the Italian battle fleet. 2 aircraft were shot down, 2 men were killed, 2 were captured. 4 casualties from 20 attacking aircraft against the entire defensive firepower of a major naval base represented extraordinary results. Some called it luck. The Italian defenses had been less effective than they should have been. The barrage balloon gaps helped. The Italian gunners were firing at night against difficult targets. But luck only explained so much. The Swordfish crews had trained for exactly this type of mission. They had practiced night carrier operations. They had rehearsed torpedo attacks. They had studied the defenses of Taranto from reconnaissance photographs. They executed the attack with precision and courage. The results were devastating to Italy. The hull bore scars from 3 separate torpedo strikes. One impacted the starboard side amidships, another struck port side amidships, and a third hit aft near the stern. The aft strike was the catastrophic one that destroyed the rudder mechanism. Yet the angle and depth of the wound suggested the torpedo may have come from a different direction than previously assumed. Multiple pilots claimed credit. The records from individual aircraft were incomplete or contradictory. What remained certain was that the Swordfish had succeeded where it mattered most. The slow, seemingly obsolete biplane had crippled the most powerful battleship afloat. The lumbering torpedo bombers had accomplished what modern fighters could not. Bismarck's fate was sealed. Her steering destroyed, her speed reduced, she could not escape. The pursuing British battleships closed in relentlessly. On May 27th, HMS Rodney and HMS King George V hammered Bismarck with massive salvos from their 16-inch guns. The German battleship returned fire, her shells striking home with devastating accuracy. HMS Rodney took several hits, but Bismarck was surrounded. Cruisers circled the dying battleship, pouring shells into her hull. The German crew fought desperately to save their ship. Fires raged below deck, boiler rooms filled with scalding steam, men died by the hundreds. The engineering spaces became infernos. Damage control efforts proved hopeless. The ship was being torn apart by gunfire and burning from within. Finally, at approximately 10:35 hours on May 27th, Bismarck's captain gave the order to abandon ship. Explosions ripped through her hull as she began to sink. The bow rose steeply as water flooded the forward compartments. The stern lifted high above the water. Hundreds of men who had not abandoned ship tumbled from the deck into the cold Atlantic. Some clung to debris, others were struck by the sinking ship. The massive hull rolled to starboard and slipped beneath the waves. The great battleship was gone. Of the approximately 2,200 men aboard Bismarck, roughly 110 were rescued. The Royal Navy destroyers and minesweepers pulled survivors from the water. Many did not survive the cold, but the immediate threat to the Atlantic convoys was ended. Bismarck lay on the ocean floor, her threat eliminated. The Swordfish had delivered the blow that changed everything. The crippling torpedo strike had transformed the entire campaign. Without the Swordfish attack, Bismarck would have reached France. She would have escaped into coastal waters where she could be reinforced and repaired. She could have operated against the convoys for months. The consequences for Britain would have been catastrophic. Instead, the slow biplanes had accomplished the impossible. The torpedo bombers that military strategists had written off as obsolete had proven themselves decisive. They had done what battleships could not do alone. They had demonstrated that naval warfare had fundamentally changed. The age of the battleship as the dominant naval weapon was ending. The age of carrier aviation was beginning. The Swordfish had shown the way. 3 battleships suffered devastating damage that night. The Comte de Cavour absorbed a torpedo strike that shattered her hull catastrophically. Water poured through the breach as her once proud structure surrendered to the sea. She settled heavily onto the harbour floor, her deck submerged beneath the murky depths. Though salvage teams eventually refloated her and transported her to Trieste, the restoration work stalled midway. She never regained full operational capability. Effectively, Italy had lost 1 battleship permanently. The Littorio fared little better. 3 torpedoes ripped into her hull, driving her dangerously close to sinking. Only frantic work by her damage control teams kept her from capsizing entirely. She spent 7 months in the yards undergoing extensive repairs before returning to limited service. The Caio Duilio took a single torpedo that flooded her boiler rooms and created a severe list that nearly capsized her. She too required 7 months of repairs. When the smoke cleared from Taranto harbour, the mathematics were brutal and stark. Italy had started the war with 6 operational battleships. After that single night of air attack, only 3 remained combat-ready. The Italian Navy's battleship strength had been cut exactly in half. The strategic balance in the entire Mediterranean shifted decisively. Britain now held the advantage. The Royal Navy could operate with far greater freedom throughout the region. Admiral Andrew Cunningham found himself with opportunities he could never have imagined before. Convoy escorts to Malta could be substantially reinforced. The shipping lanes to Egypt became far more secure. The formerly cautious British admiral could now take calculated risks he would have deemed foolhardy only days earlier. Italy's naval strategy underwent fundamental transformation. With their battleship force severely compromised, Italian commanders abandoned aggressive tactics. They shifted instead toward fleet preservation, hoarding their remaining capital ships rather than committing them to battle. The implications extended far beyond the Mediterranean itself. Naval planners in Tokyo watched the attack with intense fascination. A Japanese naval attaché traveled to Taranto in January 1941, meticulously documenting the Italian officers' accounts and photographing the damage. The lessons proved invaluable. Shallow water torpedo attacks could work with specialized modifications to the weapons. Battleships sitting in harbor made vulnerable targets for determined airstrikes. A bold carrier-launched assault could devastate a fleet before it had any chance to respond. These exact principles appeared months later at Pearl Harbor. The Taranto raid provided the template. It proved conclusively that aerial torpedoes could wreak havoc on major warships in protected harbors. It vindicated carrier aviation as a genuinely decisive weapon. Most remarkably, it demonstrated that the seemingly obsolete Swordfish, when crewed by capable pilots, could accomplish feats that appeared impossible. Yet Taranto represented merely the opening act. 6 months later came an even greater test. May 1941, brought the Bismarck sortie into the Atlantic. The newest and most formidable battleship in the German fleet, she displaced 50,300 tons when fully loaded. Her massive armament included 8 15-inch guns mounted in 4 turrets. Armor plating 12.6 inches thick protected her vital areas. She could sustain speeds exceeding 31 knots. She was designed to burst into the Atlantic shipping lanes and devastate the merchant convoys Britain depended upon for survival. The Royal Navy committed everything available to stop her. On May 24th, in the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland, HMS Hood engaged the German battleship. Hood was pride of the fleet, 42,000 tons, mounting 15-inch guns, recognized throughout the world as the largest warship afloat. The engagement lasted mere minutes. Bismarck's fifth salvo found its target. A 15-inch shell penetrated Hood's relatively thin deck armor and detonated deep within the ammunition magazine. 112 tons of propellant exploded simultaneously. The massive concussion tore the ship's hull apart. Hood sank in under 3 minutes. Over 1,400 men perished. Only 3 survived. The shock reverberated through the Royal Navy and across Britain itself. Hood had seemed invincible, an indestructible symbol of British naval supremacy. Children knew her name. She appeared on cigarette cards and picture postcards. Between the wars, she had toured the world's ports, representing British power and prestige. People believed nothing could possibly sink her, yet Bismarck had destroyed her in mere minutes. The psychological impact was staggering. If Hood could be destroyed so easily, what remained safe? Now the German battleship roamed the Atlantic, possessing both speed and firepower sufficient to slaughter merchant convoys faster than replacements could be built. Britain's entire survival rested on Atlantic shipping. Food, fuel, ammunition, raw materials, all arrived by sea. Destroyer and corvette escorts, designed to battle similar vessels, had zero chance against a battleship. Bismarck could massacre merchant ships with virtual impunity. The lifeline to America faced severance. Starvation could force Britain to surrender within months. The Admiralty dispatched every available warship to hunt her down. Battleships steamed in from multiple directions. Cruisers established search patterns. Destroyers rushed to join the chase. Yet one ship in an ocean the size of the Atlantic proved nearly impossible to locate. Radar remained primitive and limited. Air search could only extend so far. The ocean simply defied the pursuers' efforts, and if found, Bismarck might outrun or outfight any single opponent. She possessed speed, armor, and firepower sufficient for either tactic. Direct confrontation would cost lives and possibly ships. The Admiralty needed something different. They required a means to slow the battleship down, damage her steering mechanisms, jam her rudder, reduce her speed enough that pursuing battleships could catch her. They needed the fleet air arm. They needed the Swordfish. HMS Victorious was operating with the home fleet, searching for Bismarck. She carried No. 825 Naval Air Squadron, the very unit that had attacked Taranto months earlier. Their commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond. On the evening of May 24th, Bismarck was located. Admiral John Tovey, commanding the home fleet, ordered Victorious to launch aircraft. At 10 o'clock that evening, 9 Swordfish took off into worsening weather. Esmond led the formation flying toward a target 120 miles distant. The conditions were appalling. Low cloud, rain squalls, rough seas. The biplanes pressed onward regardless. Just after midnight, they located Bismarck. The battleship steamed at high speed, her anti-aircraft defenses fully alert. The Swordfish attacked from multiple angles, attempting to overwhelm the ship's defensive fire with simultaneous threats. The slow aircraft dove through tremendous flak. Shells and tracer fire streaked across the night sky, explosions blooming all around the vulnerable planes. Lieutenant Percy Gick in Aircraft 5 Fox released his torpedo. The weapon ran true, striking Bismarck amidships on the starboard side. All crews witnessed the explosion. However, the torpedo had hit the thick armor belt. The damage proved superficial. The armor had protected her, yet the impact ruptured internal fuel tanks, creating an oil leak that would prove invaluable to British forces over the following days. All 9 Swordfish returned safely to victorious despite the intense anti-aircraft fire. While the attack had failed to stop Bismarck, it confirmed the Swordfish could reach and strike even the most heavily defended targets. For 2 days, the Royal Navy hunted Bismarck across the Atlantic. The battleship remained damaged and leaking oil, but dangerous nonetheless. On May 26th, a Catalina flying boat relocated her. She was heading toward the French coast and sanctuary. If Bismarck reached Brest with its air cover and coastal defenses, she would escape. Tovey's battleships remained too distant to intercept before she reached French air protection. Only one force could get there in time, HMS Ark Royal. The carrier raced to intercept, but conditions were deteriorating into a full gale. Launching and recovering aircraft would be extremely hazardous. Attacking seemed suicidal, yet no other option existed. This represented the final opportunity to stop Bismarck. At 1450 hours, 15 Swordfish from 810 and 820 squadrons launched from Ark Royal. The carrier pitched and rolled violently, her flight deck rising and falling 40 feet with each heave. Launching proved hazardous. Several aircraft nearly crashed on takeoff. They formed up and headed toward Bismarck. Due to a radar confusion, they initially attacked HMS Sheffield by mistake. Fortunately, the magnetic detonators malfunctioned in rough seas and exploded prematurely. Sheffield escaped damage. The Swordfish returned to Ark Royal. The error was embarrassing, but ultimately fortunate. The magnetic detonators were clearly unreliable. Torpedoes were switched to contact detonators for the next strike. At 1910 hours, 15 Swordfish launched once more. Weather had deteriorated dramatically. Winds approached 60 miles per hour with stronger gusts. Rain reduced visibility to nearly zero. Some pilots could barely see their own wingtips. Waves reached 40 feet, creating mountains of water that towered above the Swordfish's flying altitude. Pilots could scarcely see their instruments in the gathering darkness. Water streamed into open cockpits, soaking instruments and making compass readings impossible. Such conditions normally prohibited flying as suicidally dangerous. Aircraft simply lacked the design for such extreme weather. Loss of control remained possible at any moment. Structural failure was constant risk. Collision with the sea and darkness seemed probable. This was no normal situation, however. The war's future might depend on the next hours. If Bismarck escaped, consequences were unthinkable. The Swordfish flew through the storm toward Bismarck. Each pilot fought his own private battle with the elements. Sub-Lieutenant John Moffat was among them. He later recalled barely controlling his aircraft. The buffeting was so severe, he feared the wings might tear off. Every gust threatened to flip the biplane inverted. Water streamed into his open cockpit, soaking him completely. His hands were numb on the controls despite thick gloves. His observer and air gunner huddled behind him, equally soaked, equally cold, equally terrified. Visibility extended only yards. Formation proved impossible to maintain. Each aircraft flew alone through the storm, navigating independently. Some pilots wondered whether they would find the target. Others wondered whether they would survive the weather at all. The fabric wings flexed and strained under the stress. The steel tube framework groaned. Yet the Swordfish held together. The robust construction that looked antiquated now proved its worth. At approximately 20:05, they found Bismarck. The battleship loomed against storm clouds, her guns already firing. The Swordfish attacked from multiple angles. Their slow speed, which made them obsolete, now became advantage. Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns were designed for tracking fast modern aircraft. The Swordfish's deliberate approach confused the fire control systems. Shells burst around them, but evasive maneuvering in rough weather made accurate fire nearly impossible. Pilots pressed attacks to point-blank range, less than 1,000 yards, some even closer. They released their torpedoes and turned away through storm of fire. At least 2 torpedoes struck Bismarck. One hit amidships on the port side, causing relatively minor damage. Armor held. Flooding was contained. This would not stop the battleship. The second struck aft near the stern. This was the critical hit. The explosion jammed Bismarck's rudder at approximately 12 degrees to port. The massive rudder designed to turn 50,000 tons of warship was locked in position. The steering gear room flooded rapidly. Damage control parties rushed to the scene and found the compartment fully flooded. Machinery was wrecked. The rudder would not move. Captain Ernst Lindemann immediately ordered emergency steering procedures. The engines could be used by varying power to the propeller shafts. This worked for slow maneuvering, but proved nearly useless at sea speed. The battleship began steaming in circles, unable to maintain course. Divers were dispatched to examine the rudder, but seas were too rough. They could not reach the damaged area. Engineering parties attempted rigging emergency steering or directly manipulating the steering gear. Nothing worked. The damage was catastrophic. The rudder would not respond. Without steering, Bismarck could not reach France. She could not even fight effectively. She was limited to 10 or 12 knots and could only steam in slow arcs, unable to take evasive action or choose her course. Admiral Günther Lütjens signaled Berlin that the ship was no longer maneuverable. He knew what that meant. British battleships were closing. Without steering, Bismarck was doomed. The identity of which Swordfish pilot fired the critical torpedo remains debated for decades. Sub-Lieutenant John Moffat is commonly credited with jamming Bismarck's rudder, having attacked from the port side in the first wave. However, when James Cameron led a diving expedition to examine the Bismarck wreck in 2002, the physical evidence proved puzzling. The hull bore scars from 3 separate torpedo strikes. One impacted the starboard side amidships, another struck port side amidships. A third hit aft near the stern. The aft strike destroyed the rudder mechanism, yet the angle and depth suggested the torpedo may have come from a different direction than previously assumed. Multiple pilots claimed credit. Individual aircraft records were incomplete or contradictory. What remained absolutely certain was that the Swordfish succeeded where it mattered most. The slow, seemingly obsolete biplane had crippled the world's most powerful battleship. The lumbering torpedo bombers had accomplished what modern fighters could not. Bismarck's fate was sealed, her steering destroyed, her speed reduced. She could not escape. Pursuing British battleships closed in relentlessly. On May 27th, HMS Rodney and HMS King George V hammered Bismarck with massive salvos from their 16-inch guns. The German battleship returned fire, her shells striking home with devastating accuracy. HMS Rodney took multiple hits, but Bismarck was surrounded. Cruisers circled the dying battleship, pouring shells into her hull. The German crew fought desperately but futilely to save their ship. Fires raged below deck, boiler rooms filled with scalding steam. Men died by the hundreds. Engineering spaces became infernos. Damage control efforts proved hopeless. The ship was being torn apart by gunfire and burning from within. Finally, at approximately 10:35 hours on May 27th, Bismarck's captain ordered abandonment. Explosions ripped through her hull as she began sinking. The bow rose steeply as water flooded forward compartments. The stern lifted high above the water. Hundreds of men who had not abandoned tumbled from the deck into the cold Atlantic. Some clung to debris, others were struck by the sinking ship. The massive hull rolled to starboard and slipped beneath the waves. The great battleship was gone. Of approximately 2,200 men aboard Bismarck, roughly 110 were rescued. Royal Navy destroyers and minesweepers pulled survivors from the water. Many did not survive the cold, but the immediate threat to Atlantic convoys was ended. Bismarck lay on the ocean floor, her threat eliminated. The Swordfish had delivered the blow that changed everything. The crippling torpedo strike had transformed the entire campaign. Without the Swordfish attack, Bismarck would have reached France. She would have escaped into coastal waters where reinforcement and repair were possible. She could have operated against convoys for months. Consequences for Britain would have been catastrophic. Instead, the slow biplanes accomplished the impossible. The torpedo bombers that military strategists had written off as obsolete proved themselves decisive. They accomplished what battleships could not achieve alone. They demonstrated that naval warfare had fundamentally changed. The battleship's age as dominant naval weapon was ending. The age of carrier aviation was beginning. The Swordfish had shown the way forward. The damage struck the starboard side, hitting the steering compartment. Only 2 pilots had approached from that direction. Sub-Lieutenant Kenneth Patterson and Sub-Lieutenant Douglas Godfrey Fawcett. The exact identity of the pilot who fired the torpedo that jammed the rudder would likely never be confirmed with absolute certainty. But it didn't matter. Multiple torpedoes found their mark that day. Any one of several aviators could have released the weapon that proved decisive. What counted was that the Swordfish squadrons, working as one coordinated force, had delivered exactly what was needed. Moffat made no attempt to claim the credit during his initial debriefing. The attribution had grown later, built by others retelling the story. Yet the facts remained unchanged. All 15 Swordfish returned safely to Ark Royal, despite the appalling weather and the murderous fire that had filled the sky around them. Getting those aircraft back down onto a pitching carrier deck in complete darkness amid a raging storm was every bit as perilous as the attack itself had been. Yet every single plane made it. Every crew walked away. By morning on May 27th, British battleships had caught up with their prey. HMS King George V and HMS Rodney closed in, their massive guns opening fire on the crippled German vessel. Bismarck returned fire but couldn't maneuver, couldn't escape. 2 hours of relentless bombardment turned her into a burning, broken hull. At 10:39 that morning, she went down into the depths. More than 2,000 men died with her. Only 115 survived. Germany's pride, the most powerful warship ever built, was gone. The immediate threat to Atlantic convoys had been eliminated. The weapon that made this possible was an aircraft that most military strategists had already written off as obsolete: the humble Swordfish. Yet the plane would continue serving throughout the entire war, adapting to new roles as the conflict evolved and demanded different things. In the Mediterranean theatre, Swordfish squadrons flying from Malta and from carriers became the primary striking force against Axis supply lines feeding North Africa. Pilots based on Malta flew night operations against Italian and German convoys, carrying vital supplies to Rommel's forces. These attacks happened in darkness, frequently in foul weather, against convoys bristling with defensive firepower. The crews developed remarkable tactics, using radar to locate convoys under cover of night before pressing home attacks with torpedoes and bombs. The results were stunning. Squadron 830, operating from Malta alone, destroyed approximately 110,000 tons of Axis shipping between May and November of 1941. That represented dozens of merchant vessels, ships carrying fuel, ammunition, food, supplies, and vehicles that never reached North Africa. Other Malta-based squadrons posted similar tallies. Conservative estimates placed the total at somewhere between 300,000 and 450,000 tons of merchant shipping destroyed by Swordfish attacks across the entire Mediterranean campaign. Each ship sent to the bottom meant supplies that never arrived. The accumulated effect was profound. Rommel himself frequently complained about the chronic shortages plaguing his forces. His offensive stuttered partly because fuel and ammunition simply didn't arrive. The Swordfish attacks on supply convoys had contributed substantially to those shortages. In the Atlantic, meanwhile, the aircraft's role shifted again as escort carriers entered service. These were small carriers, hastily converted from merchant ships. They could travel alongside convoys and furnish air protection for the entire crossing. Each escort carrier typically carried a single squadron of Swordfish for both anti-submarine work and anti-surface operations. The aircraft proved remarkably effective in this capacity. Equipped with ASV radar, Swordfish could track submarines on the surface even when darkness or poor visibility made visual detection impossible. U-boats preferred attacking at night while on the surface, where they moved faster and remained harder to spot. The radar-equipped Swordfish could find them. Once located, the submarine would face attack from depth charges or torpedoes. Between 1940 and 1945, Swordfish sank or participated in sinking between 14 and 22 U-boats. The exact count varied depending on how shared kills were credited. Some submarines fell to multiple aircraft or ships working together. Some were damaged by Swordfish but finished off by other forces. Several anti-submarine achievements deserve particular mention. U-64 went down on April 13, 1940, when Swordfish from HMS Ark Royal sent it to the bottom. This marked the first U-boat ever sunk by the Fleet Air Arm. Captain Richard Partridge of the Royal Marines flew the aircraft that caught the submarine on the surface in Norwegian waters and destroyed it with bombs. U-752 followed on May 23, 1943, sunk by a Swordfish from 819 Squadron, operating from HMS Ark. This was the first U-boat ever destroyed using air-launched rockets. The Swordfish carried 860-pound rocket projectiles mounted under its wings. These rockets showed extraordinary effectiveness against submarines. They could be fired from greater distances than depth charges and struck with superior accuracy. In September 1944, Swordfish from HMS Vindex sank 4 U-boats during a single patrol: U-344 on January 31, U-75 on May 6, U-960 on May 19, and U-1194 on June 24. This remarkable performance proved just how lethal the aging Swordfish had become in submarine warfare, despite being decades old. Yet service in the Swordfish came at terrible cost. On February 12, 1942, German battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, along with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, attempted a daring dash up the English Channel from Brest toward Germany. These ships had sat trapped in Brest for months, pounded constantly by Royal Air Force bombers. Hitler wanted them repositioned in Norway, where they could threaten Arctic convoys bound for Russia. The Channel dash, Operation Cerberus to the Germans, represented a bold gamble. The narrowest stretch of the Channel measured only 21 miles across. The German vessels would have to steam through waters where British naval and air forces held dominance. The dangers were extraordinary, but remaining in Brest meant continuing to face relentless attacks. The Royal Navy and Royal Air Force prepared a determined defense. If those German ships could be sent to the bottom in the Channel, it would constitute a tremendous victory. Coordinated attacks were planned using destroyers, motor torpedo boats, bombers, and torpedo bombers. 6 Swordfish from 825 Naval Air Squadron received the assignment for the torpedo strike. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond commanded the squadron, the same officer who had led the Bismarck strike from Victorious 9 months before. Esmond had received the Distinguished Service Order for that action. King George VI personally decorated him on February 11th, just 1 day before this new mission. The coincidence felt bitterly ironic. Esmond received recognition for bravery 1 day before being asked to undertake something far more desperate. Esmond understood what the intelligence briefing revealed. This mission bordered on suicide. The German ships would sail protected by roughly 30 escort vessels, including destroyers and torpedo boats. Over 250 Luftwaffe fighters would provide air cover above them. The Swordfish would attack in daylight rather than the darkness that had sheltered them at Taranto and against Bismarck. Fighter escort would be minimal due to coordination problems and the limited range of available Spitfires. The survival odds were negligible. Success seemed even less likely. Esmond gathered his crews and briefed them with complete honesty. The mission was essential to the war effort. The risks were extreme. Any man could decline participation without shame or consequences. Every volunteer stepped forward. Not one hesitated. They understood precisely what was being asked. They did it anyway. At 12:20 in the afternoon, 6 Swordfish lifted off from RAF Manston in Kent. They flew at wave-top height toward the German force. Spitfire fighters were supposed to meet them for escort, but coordination broke down. The Swordfish found themselves isolated, facing the entire German armada alone. Focke-Wulf 190 fighters dove from above. The slow biplanes were helpless against modern fighters. Anti-aircraft fire from the ships filled the sky with deadly metal. The Swordfish crews pressed the attack regardless. Within 20 minutes, all 6 aircraft had been shot down. 13 of the 18 crew members were killed. Eugene Esmond's plane took anti-aircraft hits and caught fire from fighter attacks. It went down into the Channel around 12:40. Esmond died, along with his observer, Sub-Lieutenant William Clinton, and his air gunner leading airman, Donald Bunce. 5 crew members survived, pulled from the freezing water. Sub-Lieutenants Edgar Lee, Brian Rose, Charles Kingsmill, and William Samples, plus leading airman Bunce, who had somehow lived through Esmond's crash. None of the torpedoes struck the German ships. The Channel dash succeeded, but the sacrifice was recognized. Eugene Esmond received the Victoria Cross posthumously, gazetted on March 3, 1942. The 5 surviving officers each received the Distinguished Service Order. Leading Airman Bunce received the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal. The 13 killed received posthumous mentions in dispatches. Even German Admiral Otto Schneewind, commanding the Dash, acknowledged the attack as a demonstration of supreme courage. The Royal Navy called it one of the finest examples of self-sacrifice and devotion to duty the war had witnessed. 805 Naval Air Squadron had struck at Taranto. They had attacked Bismarck. They had given their lives in the Channel Dash. Their courage became legendary. By 1945, when the European War ended, the Swordfish had served for 9 years. Production had stopped in August 1944 after 2,391 aircraft had rolled off production lines. The type had outlived several aircraft designed to replace it. The Fairey Albacore, intended as the Swordfish's successor, entered service in 1940 but was withdrawn from frontline service in 1943. The Albacore was faster and featured an enclosed cockpit, yet it lacked the Swordfish's reliability and adaptability. The Swordfish continued flying frontline missions until VE Day in May 1945. Few military aircraft throughout history can claim such remarkable longevity while staying operationally effective. The Swordfish earned genuine affection from everyone associated with it, pilots and mechanics alike. Aviators praised its handling characteristics, its dependability, its forgiving nature. Mechanics loved its straightforward construction and simple maintenance requirements. Crews trusted it completely. The nickname Stringbag was used with real affection and respect. The aircraft looked awkward and antiquated. It was painfully slow and uncomfortable, but it worked. In any conditions, whatever the weather, the Swordfish could be relied upon to complete the mission and return the crew safely. That dependability created loyalty that modern aircraft with superior performance never quite managed to inspire. 80 years after the Swordfish crippled Bismarck, we can now evaluate its historical significance. By every conventional measure, the Swordfish was obsolete when the war started. Maximum speed of 143 miles per hour compared to contemporary fighters exceeding 300. Open cockpit when enclosed cockpits had become standard. Fixed landing gear when retractable gear was the norm. Fabric construction when metal had become universal. A biplane when monoplanes dominated the skies. Yet this supposedly outdated aircraft achieved victories that altered the war's trajectory. At Taranto, Swordfish crippled the Italian fleet and shifted Mediterranean power balance. Against Bismarck, Swordfish delivered the strike that determined Germany's mightiest battleship's fate. Throughout the war, Swordfish protected convoys, destroyed U-boats, attacked supply ships, and handled every assignment given them. The aircraft itself was never the deciding factor. The people flying it made all the difference. The Swordfish was merely fabric and wire and steel tubing, but the men who piloted it were exceptional. They possessed superb training. The fleet air arm maintained demanding standards. Pilots mastered instrument flying, navigation, torpedo delivery, and carrier operations. Observers became expert at navigation and bombing calculations. Air gunners learned to fight off attacking fighters while managing their radio equipment simultaneously. Training was rigorous, thorough, and ongoing. The air crews possessed deep commitment. They grasped what was at stake. Britain faced the enemy largely alone throughout much of the conflict. Every operation mattered. Every strike counted. Failure meant defeat and possible invasion. Success meant national survival. The stakes could not have been higher. The tactics demonstrated real innovation. Rather than accept the Swordfish's limitations as fatal, the fleet air arm leveraged its advantages. In night attacks, speed mattered less. Low-altitude approaches stayed beneath radar coverage. Coordinated strikes from several directions overwhelmed defensive systems. Using the aircraft's slow speed to confuse anti-aircraft fire control computers, the tactics transformed apparent weaknesses into genuine strengths. The commitment was unwavering. Swordfish crews attacked through defensive barrages that should have been unsurvivable. They flew operations in weather that kept other aircraft grounded. They held formation when conditions made it nearly impossible. They completed missions when escape seemed the only rational choice. That resolve was the difference between achievement and disaster. Superior personnel operating adequate equipment will prevail over adequate personnel with superior equipment. This principle extends far beyond aviation. In virtually any competitive situation, human factors dominate technology. Training, drive, ingenuity, and resolve outweigh specifications and specifications. The Germans possessed Bismarck, the most formidable battleship in existence. They had advanced technology overall, but they lacked superior personnel at the critical moment. The Swordfish crews, piloting aircraft widely considered outdated, possessed the expertise and fortitude to achieve the seemingly impossible. Britain in 1941 couldn't match German technology everywhere. British tanks underperformed German tanks. British fighters roughly equaled German fighters. British bombers lacked sufficient range, yet Britain could develop superior crews and create superior tactics. The Swordfish program represents this strategy perfectly. Take whatever aircraft you have available, develop crews to peak capability, create tactics that function effectively, execute them with complete commitment, face the dangers head-on, complete the objective. The strategy succeeded. When the war concluded, the men who flew Swordfish transitioned to civilian existence, carrying memories of extraordinary experiences. They had flown aged aircraft into seemingly impossible circumstances and won. They had encountered death repeatedly and lived through it. They had done things that would seem like fiction if not thoroughly verified. Their accomplishment reaches beyond combat victories. The Swordfish crews proved that technological disadvantage need not result in defeat. They demonstrated that highly trained, deeply motivated people can overcome material limitations. They established that expertise and courage matter more than technical specifications. These principles remain valid 80 years afterward. In a time focused on cutting-edge technology, the Swordfish reminds us that human qualities drive results. Businesses invest substantially in equipment while sometimes undervaluing training, maintenance, and morale. The Swordfish example suggests this approach gets things backward. Prioritize people first. Excellent people will discover ways to make ordinary equipment work effectively. The Fairey Swordfish started service in 1936, already considered outdated. It remained operational until 1945, outlasting aircraft created to replace it. It secured victories that shaped history. It won the admiration and trust of everyone involved with it. The string bag, slow, ungainly, obsolete, yet lethal when operated by skilled hands. The Germans dismissed Britain's antique biplane until torpedoes from that biplane disabled Bismarck and sealed her destiny. Then the joke stopped. The world discovered what the fleet air arm already knew. The Swordfish, despite every limitation, was precisely the tool Britain required at precisely the right moment. That constitutes the story of the Fairey Swordfish and the remarkable individuals who flew it into legend.